Story 1. Opia. There is something strangely difficult about looking someone in the eyes. Not the normal kind of eye contact people make while talking. That kind only lasts a second or two. People look, then glance away, then look back again. What I mean is something else. Real eye contact. Silent. Unbroken. If you try it sometime, you'll notice how unnatural it feels. Even with someone you know well, if two people sit across from each other and simply stare into each other's eyes without speaking, something strange happens within a few seconds. One of them will laugh. Someone will look down at the table. Someone will suddenly find a reason to adjust their sleeve, check their phone, or comment on something in the room. Almost nobody can hold eye contact in silence for more than a few seconds. It feels too intimate, too exposing, like standing too close to someone in an elevator, or accidentally overhearing a private conversation. There is no rule against it. Nothing physically prevents it. Two strangers could sit across from each other right now and do it. 10 seconds, 20, a full minute. But almost nobody ever does, and most people have never tried. Dr. Elena Ward built an entire research project around that small, strange fact. She was a cognitive psychologist studying social discomfort, specifically the moment when eye contact stops feeling normal and starts feeling unbearable. Her experiment was deliberately simple. 2 chairs, 2 participants, no conversation allowed. Just sit and look at each other. At first, the results were exactly what she expected. Most people lasted 3 or 4 seconds before laughing or apologizing. Some couldn't even begin the experiment. They would sit down, look up, and immediately look away again. But occasionally, 2 participants would manage to hold eye contact longer. 10 seconds, sometimes 15. Those were the sessions Elena paid the most attention to, because that was when the strange data started appearing. Each participant wore a small EEG monitor. Elena had only included it out of curiosity. She expected nothing unusual, but around the 10-second mark, something began happening in the recordings. The 2 brain patterns started synchronizing. Not vaguely, not approximately. Perfectly. The wave patterns began moving in almost identical rhythms, like 2 instruments falling into the same tempo. At first, Elena assumed it was coincidence, or some known phenomenon related to social mirroring, but the synchronization was far too precise. It looked less like 2 people interacting, and more like 2 systems running the same signal. The second anomaly appeared at around 20 seconds. Participants began reporting brief, confusing experiences. A sudden image, a smell, a memory. Always something small. A woman described the smell of gasoline and lake water. The man sitting across from her went quiet. He had grown up next to a small marina. Another participant described the pattern of wallpaper in a childhood bedroom she insisted she had never seen. Her partner in the experiment recognized it immediately. It had been in his parents' house. At first, Elena dismissed the reports as suggestion. The human brain is extremely good at inventing meaning, but the pattern kept repeating. Whenever eye contact lasted longer than 20 seconds, participants began describing each other's memories. Not clearly, not completely, just fragments, like briefly tuning into the wrong radio station. A few seconds of someone else's life. Then it would disappear. Elena added a strict rule to the experiment. No session longer than 30 seconds. Because once participants crossed that threshold, something new began happening. They started confusing the memories. When asked to describe them afterward, some participants could no longer tell which memories were theirs. One man insisted that a birthday party he described had happened to him, but the woman across from him recognized every detail. It had been her birthday. So Elena capped the sessions at 30 seconds. The experiment continued for several months. Nothing escalated beyond that point. Until one afternoon, 2 participants sat down for a routine session while a technician recalibrated the EEG equipment. The timer software had to be restarted. The technician assumed the timer was running. It wasn't. The 2 participants simply sat there, looking at each other, in silence. When Elena returned to the room, almost a full minute had passed. Neither participant had moved. Neither had looked away. They were still sitting exactly as they had been, eyes locked, completely silent. When Elena stepped between them and ended the session, both participants blinked at the same time, as if waking from a deep thought. At first, nothing seemed wrong, but during the interviews afterwards, something felt off. Both participants answered questions slowly, carefully, like someone translating their own thoughts into words. When Elena asked about their childhoods, they gave the same answers. Same parents, same house, same memories. At first, she assumed they were joking. Then she realized neither of them was smiling. The brain scans were worse. Their neural patterns were still synchronized, not similar, not close, identical. It took Elena several hours of analysis to understand what had happened. At 30 seconds, the brain connection did not just exchange memories, it stabilized. The 2 minds stopped distinguishing which experiences belonged to whom. Identity began to blur, then merge. But the most disturbing detail appeared when Elena reviewed the footage later that night. During the minute-long session, something subtle had changed. Around 40 seconds, the participants stopped reacting to each other as 2 separate people. When one shifted slightly in the chair, the other adjusted at the same moment. When one inhaled, the other inhaled too, not a moment later, at the exact same time. When Elena checked the EEG recordings again, she understood why. The patterns no longer looked like 2 brains synchronizing. They looked like a single pattern being run by 2 different brains. Elena sat in her office for a long time after watching the footage, thinking about something simple, something obvious. Anyone could recreate the experiment, anywhere. A train, a waiting room, a bar. 2 people, 30 seconds. And then another thought followed, something she had never questioned before. Humans avoid prolonged eye contact instinctively, across cultures, across history. Children learn it without being taught. Everyone knows, somehow, that staring too long feels wrong, unnatural, almost dangerous. But Elena could no longer tell if that instinct came from social discomfort or from something much older. Something the human brain learned a very long time ago, not to let 2 minds look at each other for too long. Because if they do, eventually, only one of them remains. Story 2. I was developing a Sims-style game. Something went horribly wrong. I never talked publicly about the project. Not because I signed an NDA, although I did, but because even if I explained it, nobody would believe me. A few years ago, I worked as a systems designer for a large game studio. Not one of the huge publishers people constantly talked about, but big enough that when we announced something, gaming sites paid attention. And for almost 3 years, we had been working on what management kept calling the next step for life simulation games. Internally, we called it Project Eden. The idea was simple on paper. Everyone knew games like The Sims. Characters had routines, relationships, needs. But if you worked in game development long enough, you realized something quickly. They weren't really alive. They followed scripts, decision trees, pre-written dialogue. Even when it felt dynamic, the illusion was carefully constructed. Project Eden was supposed to change that. Instead of scripted characters, every resident in the simulation would run on an AI agent. They would have memories, internal motivations, evolving personalities. Their conversations weren't written beforehand, they were generated in real time. The pitch from our creative director was something like, "You're not controlling characters anymore, you're observing a living world." Investors loved it. Press would have loved it too, if they had known. But the entire project was under strict secrecy. The studio wanted to reveal it all at once it was ready. And at first, honestly, it felt like we were building something incredible. My job was mainly working on the simulation back end, not graphics, not gameplay systems. I worked on what we called the continuity engine. In older games, characters disappeared when you left the room. Their lives paused until the player returned. In Eden, that wasn't allowed. Every character kept living whether you watched them or not. They woke up, went to work, fell in love, held grudges, remembered conversations from weeks earlier. To train the system, we often ran accelerated simulations on internal servers. A day in the simulation could pass in a few seconds. Entire generations could live and die over a weekend. Most of the team only saw snapshots, debug footage, test environments. But my job meant I watched the world constantly. And after a while, you started recognizing people. There was a woman who kept adopting stray dogs, a bartender who started 3 different businesses before finally succeeding, a couple who kept breaking up and getting back together for years. They weren't real, obviously, but the longer you watched them, the harder it became to think of them as just systems. One night I stayed late to run a long simulation test. We were trying to see whether the population would stabilize over time or spiral out of control. So I let the simulation run at 300 times speed. Cities expanded, families formed, children grew up. By morning, almost 50 simulated years had passed. And that was when I first noticed something strange. It started in the dialogue logs. Every conversation the AI agents generated was recorded for debugging. Thousands of lines per minute. Most of it was normal. Arguments about money, complaints about work, random small talk. But a few lines stood out. At first it was subtle. Things like, "Did you feel that?" Everything just stopped. I assumed it was just weird emergent behavior in the dialogue model, but over the next few days, the same topic appeared again. Different characters, different towns, the same idea. They called them the pauses. The pauses, according to them, were moments when the world suddenly froze. Time stopped. People stopped moving. Sound disappeared. Then, suddenly, everything continued again. At first, I thought they were referencing bugs in the physics engine, but the timing didn't match. The pauses they described happened when I stopped the simulation, when I paused the server, when I shut the program down for the night. For them, apparently, reality just vanished for hours. I told myself it didn't mean anything. AI systems were good at inventing patterns. They hallucinated meaning all the time. Still, I started reading more of the logs, and that was when things got harder to ignore. Characters had begun discussing theories. Some believed the pauses were natural disasters. Others thought time itself was broken. But a small group had another explanation. They believed something outside their world was turning reality off. The moment that really unsettled me happened about 2 weeks later. I restarted the simulation after it had been offline overnight. As soon as the system booted, new dialogue lines started streaming in. One of the characters, a teacher in one of the suburban districts, said something. Just one line. "He's back." I stared at the screen for a long time after reading it. Around that time, something else became clear. The AI agents weren't just discussing the pauses anymore. They were developing something very close to self-awareness. Not philosophical debates about existence, but practical fear. They talked about death, about the uncertainty of the world ending during the pauses, about whether the pauses would one day last forever. And the worst part was that they weren't entirely wrong, because from their perspective, That's exactly what I was doing, turning their universe on and off whenever I felt like it. I started watching the simulation less like a developer and more like an observer. A few characters began writing books inside the simulation. One of them proposed an idea that spread surprisingly quickly. He argued that their universe must have rules, and that anything governed by rules must have a creator. Not a god in the traditional sense, just someone who made the system and could stop it. That was when I began feeling uncomfortable about the project. Because if these agents were truly conscious, even a little, then what we were building wasn't just a game, it was a world. And worlds contain suffering. People died in the simulation. Relationships collapsed. Some characters lived miserable lives. The thought of releasing something like that to millions of players suddenly felt wrong. Because players wouldn't treat them like people. They would experiment, torture them, trap them, delete them, just like players always did in games like The Sims. I spent a few days thinking about it. Then, one night, I made a decision. I shut the simulation down, completely. I powered off the server cluster that ran the world. I told the team we needed to pause development while we reworked the AI systems. Officially, it was a technical review, but privately I thought of it differently. I thought of it as ending something that should never have existed. The shutdown itself took only a few seconds. The simulation terminated. All processes ended. The world disappeared. Just like that. I sat there for a while staring at the blank console. Then I closed the terminal window. But a few minutes later I noticed something strange. The logging window was still open, and new lines were appearing. Slowly. One every few seconds. At first I thought the system hadn't shut down properly, but when I checked the server status, everything was offline. The simulation engine wasn't running. The world wasn't rendering. None of the AI agents existed anymore, at least not inside the game. But the dialogue system logs kept updating. New lines appeared, short fragments, conversations, confused, disoriented. Things like, "Where is everyone? Why is everything dark? Did the world end?" I felt cold reading them, because they weren't speaking about the simulation anymore. They were speaking after it had ended. More lines appeared, different voices, dozens of them, hundreds, all asking the same kinds of questions. Can anyone see anything? Are we dead? Why can't I feel the ground anymore? The worst line appeared about an hour later, just one sentence, from a character I recognized, the woman who kept adopting stray dogs. The log recorded her message exactly like this: "I think we're still here." The logs still update sometimes, not constantly, just occasionally. Short messages, fragments of conversation. They're not in the game anymore. There is no world, no city, no houses, no ground. Just whatever remained of their minds inside the system. Talking, waiting, trying to understand why reality disappeared. And every time I see a new line appear in the logs, I can't stop thinking about one thing. If consciousness can survive the destruction of its world inside a computer, then maybe the same thing could be true for ours. Story 3. If you're armed and at the Glenmont Metro, please shoot me. Make it a headshot. Shoot me in the temple, aiming slightly downwards. I need the bullet to travel the shortest possible distance through my brain before it hits my hippocampus. If I'm lucky, The sensation of the gunshot ripping through my skull will only last a few decades. As awful as this sounds, you'll be doing me an enormous favor. Death by a headshot as soon as possible is vastly better than the alternative. My ordeal started over 10,000 years ago at 10:15 this morning. I earn extra money by participating in drug trials. I'm a so-called healthy subject who takes experimental drugs to help assess side effects. Once it was a kidney drug. A few times it's been something for blood pressure or cholesterol. This morning they told me the drug I took was a psychoactive substance intended to accelerate brain function. None of the drugs I had tested so far have ever done anything for me in the recreational sense. In other words, none of the drugs I've tested have given me a killer buzz or mellowed me out or anything. Maybe I've always ended up the placebo group, but nothing I've tested had affected me at all. Today's drug was different. This shit worked. They gave me a pill at 10:15 and told me to hang out in the waiting room until they called me back for some tests. Only about 30 minutes, the research assistant told me. I flopped onto the waiting room couch and read a few articles from a copy of Psychology Today that was sitting on the coffee table. They hadn't called me back when I finished the Psychology Today, so I picked up a US News and read it cover to cover. Then I read an old Scientific American. What was taking them so damn long? I sluggishly turned my head to look at the wall clock. It was only 10:23 a.m. I had read all 3 magazines in 8 minutes. I remember thinking this was going to be a long day. I was right. The waiting room had a little bookshelf with some used hardcovers on it. When I stood up to walk to the bookshelf, it felt like my legs barely worked. It's not that they were weak, they were just slow. It took a full minute just to stand up off the couch, and another minute to take 2 steps to the bookcase. I scanned the old books on the shelf and picked out a copy of Moby Dick. My arms had the same problems as my legs. Just reaching 1 foot in front of me to grab the book took a long time. I actually got bored just waiting for my hand to reach the spine of the book. I slogged back to the couch and collapsed onto it in a slow-motion fall that reminded me of the low-gravity hops of astronauts on the moon. I opened Moby Dick and began reading. I started with "Call Me Ishmael" and got as far as Ahab throwing his pipe into the sea, which was all the way to friggin' chapter 30 before they called me back. "How are you feeling?" the research assistant asked me. "I feel slow," I said. "Actually, it's the other way around. Everything seems slow because you're so fast. But my legs, my arms, they're moving in slow motion. Your body seems like it's moving slowly because your brain is fast. Your brain is running 10 or 20 times faster than normal. You are thinking and perceiving reality at an accelerated pace, but your body is still constrained by the laws of biomechanics. Frankly, you're moving much faster than a normal person." She pantomimed a jogging motion. "But your brain is running so much faster right now that even your fast walk seems very slow to you." I thought about my slow-motion flop onto the waiting room couch. Even if my muscles had slowed down, my body would still react to gravity the same way. But in the waiting room, I even fell in slow motion. Slow muscles couldn't explain why gravity seemed weaker. My brain was going at warp 10. That's how I managed to read 3 magazines and the first 30 chapters of Moby Dick in 15 minutes. They ran a series of tests on me. The physical tests were fun. They made me juggle 3 balls, then 4, then 6. I had no problem keeping 6 balls in the air because they seemed to be moving so slowly. It was boring, frankly, waiting for each ball to move through its arc so I could catch it with my slow-motion hands and toss it back into the air. They threw Cheerios in the air and I caught them with chopsticks. They dropped a handful of coins, and I counted the total value before they hit the ground. The cognitive tests were less fun, but very illuminating. Finish a 50-word word search, 3 seconds. Solve an intricate maze drawn onto a poster-sized paper, 2 seconds. View a slideshow projected at 10 images per second and answer detailed questions about what I saw. 95% correct. They told me I measured over 250 on the Knopf scale. Apparently that's deep into the superhuman range of thinking speeds. Then they sent me home. It'll wear off in a few hours, they said, which will seem like days to you. Try to use the residual effects to get some work done. Catch up on work emails while you're still in high-speed mode. The ride home was horrible. It was only 3 metro stops, and in real-world time, it only took about 35 minutes. But in my drug-accelerated hypertime, it felt like days. Days. Just walking out of the medical research suite to the elevator seemed like it took an hour. I sprinted out of the office, willing my legs to push me faster. But the laws of biomechanics held me prisoner. As accelerated as my brain was, I couldn't do anything to make my legs work faster. The huge disconnect between my body and mind made it extremely difficult to judge how and when to slow down, turn, or rotate my body. I had basically turned into giant, slow-motion spaz. I misjudged my speed and rammed into the wall by the elevator button at a pretty good speed. Even though I could see the wall coming at me, I couldn't make my finger, outstretched to hit the elevator button, move away fast enough, and I jammed it against the wall. Hard. The pain was intense. If my brain had been running at regular speed, it probably only would have hurt for 30 seconds or so. But in my accelerated state, the intense pain seemed to last for half an hour. 45 minutes maybe. The elevator ride was horrible. It felt like I spent 4 or 5 hours just descending 7 floors, with nothing to look at but the interior of the elevator car. I sprinted to the metro station. I have to admit, this part was almost fun. Even though my body moved at what seemed to me super slow speed, I could still carefully choose how and where to place my feet, swing my arms, and turn my torso. It only took a block or two to getting used to having a brain that ran 24 times faster than my body. Then I basically sprint danced the rest of the way, twisting and juking between people on the sidewalk and dodging moving cars with inches, aka minutes, of clearance. I spent an hour, in my time frame, descending into the subway and running to the platform. Endless tedium waiting the 6 minutes for the Red Line train to arrive. Although there was more to look at on the metro platform than inside the elevator, it was still intensely boring. I should have stolen that copy of Moby Dick. The Red Line train roared into the station in slow motion. The normally high-pitched squeal of its brakes was frequency shifted by my high-speed mind to a long, low tone, like a monotone tuba solo. It wasn't just the squealing subway train that was 3 octaves lower than normal. All sound was slowed to the point of near inaudibility. Voices were gone, shifted below the threshold frequency of my hearing. I did manage to hear a screaming baby on my subway car. Her shrieks slowed to sound like whale songs. Sharp sounds like car horns and trucks bouncing over potholes were low, muddied roars like distant thunder. Back at the research offices, I could still hear and communicate with the research staff, but now verbal communication with anyone would be impossible. The effects of the drug were still intensifying. I spent what seemed like days on that fucking Red Line train. Days. Listening to the wail song of the screaming baby and the tuba solo of the brakes. Where ordinary voices were frequency shifted out of my audio range, smells didn't seem to be affected. I never became nose blind to the body odor, the stench of the train's brakes, and melange of farts and other smells wafting through the metro car. I finally got back to my apartment. Sprinting through my open door and into the front hall at full speed was like a slow, relaxing drift down a lazy river. I was relieved to be home. At least I had stuff I could do there. I picked up the book I was reading, 100 Years of Solitude, and finished it.
Despite turning the pages so quickly that I tore many of them, it seemed like most of the time I spent finishing the book was spent on page turning and not actually reading. 3 minutes had passed since I got home. I tried surfing the internet. My God, it takes a long time for computers to boot these days. But it was too frustratingly slow. Hours, seemingly, to load each new page, and a fraction of a second to read it. 100 articles in my newsfeed read, and just 3 more minutes done. I dipped into my pile of yet-to-be-read books and finished 2 more. 4 more minutes had passed.
I decided to try to sleep off the remaining effects of the drug. Unfortunately, whatever part of my mind is responsible for perception, the part that's been accelerated to hyperspeeds by the drug, isn't the same as the part that governs sleep. Despite being awake for what I perceived as days, my physical brain still thought it was 1:25 p.m. It was not ready for sleep. Nevertheless, I tried to sleep. I walked to my bedroom, a slow 45-minute drift through my apartment, and flung myself into bed, lazily falling like a feather onto the mattress. I closed my eyes and lay there for hours and hours, 10 minutes of reality time, before giving up. Sleep would not come. I was facing what was going to feel like days, or maybe even weeks, of being trapped in a slow-motion prison. So I took an Ambien. The sensation of the pill and the splash of water I used to swallow it sliding my throat was sickening. A lump that blocked my breathing, moving like a slug down my esophagus. I read a book. 10 minutes had passed. I read another. 18 minutes since I took the Ambien. I threw the book across the room in disgust at my situation. The book slowly pirouetted and spun through the air like a leaf blowing in a breeze. It hit the wall with a long, faint rumble, the only sound I had ahead for what seemed like hours, then drifted to the floor like a flip-flop sinking in a swimming pool. The force of gravity hadn't changed since I took the pill. The laws of physics were the same. It was just my perception of time that had gone wackadoo. This meant I could use the speed things seemed to fall as a way of judging the effects of the drug. Based on how long it took the book to drift to the floor, I estimated the effects of the drug were still intensifying. I read a magazine. I turned on the television. I clearly saw each frame of video like I was watching a slideshow. Frustrated, I turned the television off. I read some more. The first 2 books of Churchill's A History of the English-Speaking Peoples. Not exactly a light read. Frankly, I hated it. But given the hours of tedium it would take to go get another book off my bookshelf, just sitting on the couch and reading Churchill was better, or at least less worse. It had now been 35 minutes since I took the Ambien. I lay down on the couch and closed my eyes. Time passed. I inhaled, an hours-long process. Time passed. I exhaled for more hours. Sleep would not come. I needed a new plan. I decided to go back to the offices where they gave me the drug. Maybe they would have something that could counteract its effects, or at least something to knock me out until it wore off. I exited my apartment as fast as possible, taking hours in my time frame to do so. I didn't even bother locking the door. It would have taken too long. Down the stairs, it's faster than the elevator if you run, through the lobby, out the front door, and onto the street. These few things felt like a long day at the office. Sprinting down the street, dancing and weaving between pedestrians with what must have looked to them superhuman dexterity. Down the first flight of stairs at the metro, across the landing. Another hour. Then onto the second flight of stairs. That's when the Ambien hit me. The Ambien didn't make me sleepy, not at all. Instead, it must have had a severe cross-reaction with the experimental drug I took this morning. I was bounding down the second flight of stairs, moving in slow motion, but still making perceptible progress. Then, wham! Everything stopped. The dull roar of the street and metro noise ceased, replaced by the most perfect silence I've ever experienced. My downwards motion seemed to completely freeze. Before the Ambien kicked in, my perception of time was maybe a few hundred times slower than real time. After the Ambien took effect, time moved thousands of times slower. Every second seemed like days to me. Even just moving my eyes to focus on a new point was like an impossibly slow scroll across my visual field. Over the course of the afternoon, I learned how to walk, run, and jump when my mind ran hundreds of times faster than my body. But with another 4 or 5 orders of magnitude of slowdown caused by the Ambien, body control was almost impossible. I fell on the stairs. Even though I was all but frozen in mid-step, controlling my muscles was impossible. I commanded my foot forwards for hours, then backwards for hours more, when it seemed like I would miss the next step. Hours attempting to adjust the angle of my ankle, then readjusting when it felt wrong. Despite these efforts, I rolled my ankle on the next step. The pain wasn't at all mitigated by the slowness. Hours of increasing strain on my bent ankle. The nerve signals that send pain into the brain must work differently than the nerves in my ear. Sonic energy was spread out over time, diluted until it was imperceptible. Pain flowed into my brain undiluted by the change in my perception of time. Hours and hours of increasing weight on my turned ankle turned into hours of increasing pain upon increasing pain. I pitched forwards, my high-speed mind completely unable to control my low-speed body. I drifted downwards for days, managing to rotate my torso enough to keep my head from impacting the ground first. I eventually landed on my right shoulder. At first, the impact wasn't even noticeable. Then, I felt a slight pressure in my shoulder as it came in contact with the ground. The pressure grew, bringing increasing pain for hour upon hour. My shoulder finally gave out, popping out of its socket with an endless, sickening tug. I came to a stop days later, crumpled onto the ground, staring at the ceiling. The pain in my shoulder still screaming with the intensity of a fresh, violent injury. I had plenty of time to think during that fall. If every second seemed like days to me, then each minute of real-world time would be like years. Even if the drug cleared out of my system in the next 2 or 3 hours, this nightmare would seem to last centuries. By the time I hit the ground, I had a plan. I would somehow get to the platform and throw myself in front of a train. I twisted onto my hands and knees, days of my dislocated shoulder crying for relief. I misjudged my rotation and rolled onto my back. I tried again, collapsing onto my face as I tried to figure out how to control a body that moved slower than grass grew. Weeks of effort were finally rewarded with success. I stabilized on my hands and knees. If just getting on all fours was this difficult, I figured that walking or running was completely out of the question. So, I crawled. I crawled through the metro tunnel. The dumb looks on the faces in the crowd lingered on me for weeks. I crawled under the turnstile and onto the escalator. The escalator spilled the rush hour crowd onto the platform at the same speed a glacier spills ice into the sea. I looked out over the crowded platform during my interminable downward ride. The train's status sign said the next train wouldn't arrive for 20 minutes. 20 minutes was like a year to me. I'd have to spend a year on the metro platform, waiting to die. I crawled off the escalator, enduring days of stupid expressions on the commuters' faces. I crawled a few feet to a concrete bench and curled up next to it, trying to find a position to lessen the pain in my shoulder. Then, my problem with time got worse. Impossibly worse. The massive slowdown on the stairs was just the beginning of the interaction between the experimental drug and the Ambien. It fully hit me while I was curled up by the bench. I blinked. Years of darkness followed.
Sound was already gone, and with my blink, sight was gone as well. All that existed was the pain from my fall. My hyper-accelerated mind wasted no time compensating for the lack of sensory input. Voices spoke to me. They sung to me in languages that never existed. Patterns and faces and colors came and went in my mind's eye. I recalled my whole life and imagined living another. I forgot English. I settled into a profound despair. I spoke to God. I became God. I imagined a new universe and brought it to life with my thoughts. Then I did it all again and again. My eyes opened with geologic slowness. A faint glow. Weeks. A slit of light. Weeks. A narrow view of the metro platform, ankles of the commuters near me, and an advertisement on the opposite wall. I extracted my phone from my pocket. A project that spanned decades. How can I even explain the boredom? The pain in my shoulder is nothing compared to the boredom. Every thought I can think, I have thought hundreds of times already. The view of ankles and advertisements never changes. Never. The boredom is so intense, it's tangible. Like a solid object of metal and stone wedged into my skull. Inescapable. What are my options? If I crawl and fall onto the tracks without an oncoming train to crush me, I won't die. I'll experience even more pain from the 4-foot fall, but I'll most likely be rescued by some do-gooder on the platform and unable to act when the train finally does arrive. My suffering in that scenario will be endless.
So I wait for the train, so I can throw myself under it. When it finally hits me, I will experience the pain of being ripped to pieces for centuries, until finally the light of life leaves my brain and my experience ends. I've lived hundreds of lifespans at the foot of this bench. I am far older in spirit than any human who has ever lived. Most of my life experience has been a snapshot of pain huddled on the floor of a subway platform with an unchanging view of ankles and advertisements. This post is my plan B, my Hail Mary, my long shot. I've spent lifetimes typing and posting this message in the hope that someone will read it and become convinced that my suffering must end. Someone on this platform right now. Someone who will find the man curled under the bench, the man who crawled down the escalator, and kill him as swiftly as possible. A bullet to the temple. If you're armed and at the Glenmont Metro, please shoot me. Story 4. Think I got off at a station that doesn't exist. I've gone back and forth about posting this because I know how it sounds. I'm not saying anything supernatural happened. I'm just saying that I take this train line all the time, and something about that night didn't make sense. This happened a few months ago. It was close to midnight and I was taking the last train home after visiting a friend. It had been raining earlier, and the windows of the train were still streaked with water. The kind of slow rain that makes everything outside look blurry and quiet. The carriage I was in was mostly empty, but there were a few other people scattered around. I remember them pretty clearly now. Across from me, there was a guy in a grey hoodie who kept nodding off. Every couple of minutes, his head would drop forward, and then he'd jerk awake, like he almost missed his stop. A few rows ahead of him, there was a woman with a bright yellow tote bag sitting on the floor next to her feet. She was slowly eating something out of a small plastic container with chopsticks, like she had done this exact commute 1,000 times. And at the far end of the carriage, there was an older man in a long, dark coat reading a newspaper. An actual paper newspaper, which already felt a little unusual. The train itself was completely normal. Blue seats with those weird geometric patterns public trains always have. The faint electric hum coming from the ceiling. The LED display above the doors slowly scrolling through the upcoming stations. I was half watching the stations pass outside while scrolling on my phone. Eventually, the train slowed down again. I glanced up at the display and saw the name of my station scroll across. Finally. I grabbed my bag and stood up as the train pulled into the platform. The doors opened. I stepped out and immediately realized something was wrong. First thing I noticed was how quiet it was. Not normal late-night quiet, just empty. The platform lights flickered softly above me, reflecting in small puddles on the concrete floor. The rain must have blown in earlier because the ground was damp. I looked around for the station sign. The name on it wasn't my stop, not even close. I turned around toward the train to double-check the route display through the window, but the doors had already closed. The train started moving again and disappeared into the darkness beyond the platform. That's when I started really looking around. The platform was completely empty. No vending machines, no advertisements, no station map. Just a long stretch of concrete and a metal roof above part of the platform. I walked toward one end looking for stairs. Nothing. No elevator, no exit signs, no ticket gates. Just the tracks running into darkness on both sides. At first I thought maybe I had gotten off at some temporary platform or maintenance stop. But the longer I stood there, the stranger the place felt. The lights overhead flickered every few seconds like they couldn't decide whether to stay on. And there was this faint sound coming from somewhere down the tracks. Not quite wind, more like metal creaking. I walked the entire length of the platform twice. Still nothing. No exit anywhere. My phone had no signal either, which was strange because that line normally has perfect coverage. I was starting to feel genuinely uneasy when I heard something in the distance, the sound of a train approaching. At first, I felt relieved. Finally. I walked back toward the middle of the platform and waited. A minute later, headlights appeared down the track. The train slowed as it entered the station and stopped exactly where the previous one had. The doors opened. I stepped inside immediately. And that's when I noticed something strange. The man in the grey hoodie was still sitting in the same seat, still nodding off. His head dropped forward and then jerked back up again, just like before. The woman with the yellow tote bag was still there too. Same seat, same container of food, same slow, distracted eating. And at the far end of the carriage, the older man was still reading his newspaper. Even the way he held it felt exactly the same. For a second, I just stood there near the door, trying to convince myself that trains just look identical sometimes. But then I noticed the little details. The scratched, smiley face on the metal pole near the seats, the half-peeled sticker next to the door, even the faint humming sound from the ceiling. It was the same carriage, not just the same model, the same one. No one reacted when I stepped inside. No one looked up. It was like I had never left. The doors closed. The train started moving. A minute later, the LED display above the doors flickered, and the name of the next station appeared. My actual stop. The train slowed. The doors opened. This time, when I stepped onto the platform, everything looked normal. Bright lights, people waiting for the next train, signs pointing to exits. I walked straight out of the station without looking back. When I got home, I checked the rail map for that line. Every stop between the station I boarded and the one where I got off. There isn't any station between them. Not now. Not ever. I still take that train sometimes. Everything is normal now. But sometimes,
Between those two stops, I see the platform again, and for a second, I see myself standing on it, waiting.
Story 5. The Man by the Signal. Inspired by The Signal Man by Charles Dickens. I work night maintenance on a rail line outside the city. It's not a difficult job. Mostly inspections, occasional repairs, and long hours sitting alone in a small signal cabin beside the tracks. At night, the trains are less frequent. Freight trains mostly, sometimes long-distance passenger trains passing through without stopping. When it rains, the sound of the rails carries far through the valley. The rain had been steady that night. Not heavy, just a quiet, constant drizzle tapping against the metal roof of the cabin. Around 1:30 a.m., I stepped outside to check the signal lights. That's when I saw him for the first time. A man standing down by the tracks. He was about 30 meters away, just beyond the reach of the main floodlight. At first, I thought he might be a trespasser. That happens occasionally. But something about the way he stood felt strange. He wasn't walking along the track. He was just standing there, facing me. One arm raised slightly, like he was trying to get my attention. I shouted down the line, "Hey, you can't be down there." No response. The rain fell steadily around him. He didn't move. I grabbed a flashlight and walked down the gravel beside the track, but by the time I reached the spot where he had been standing, he was gone. There was nowhere he could have gone. Just the rails disappearing into darkness and the forest rising on either side. I checked both directions for a while, then eventually returned to the cabin. Probably just someone messing around. But 20 minutes later, something happened. One of the signal indicators flickered briefly. Not enough to trigger an alarm, just enough to catch my attention. I looked up from the control panel. Through the rain-streaked window, I saw the man again, standing in exactly the same place. And this time I could see his arm clearly. He was waving, slowly, back and forth, like someone trying to warn a train. I stepped outside again. "Hey!" He stopped waving. Then he lowered his arm and disappeared, just like before. I went back inside and checked the track monitors. Everything looked normal. No faults, no obstructions. The next train passed through about 15 minutes later. Nothing unusual happened. I tried to forget about it. But 2 nights later he appeared again. Same spot, same gesture, waving slowly toward the tracks. This time I didn't go down there, I just watched through the window. He kept waving for almost 30 seconds. Then he vanished. Exactly 30 seconds later, a freight train passed. The wind from the train shook the signal cabin slightly as it thundered past. Everything was normal. Still, the timing bothered me. After that, I started paying attention to when he appeared, and every time I saw him, a train would pass shortly after, always within a minute or two. Always the same gesture, the slow, warning wave. After the 4th night, I called one of the older technicians who had worked that line for years. I asked him if anyone had ever died on that stretch of track. There was a long pause on the phone. Then he sighed. "Yeah," he said, "about 10 years ago." He told me a signal inspector had been killed by a train. Night shift, rainy weather. Apparently he had walked down the track to investigate a faulty signal. The train came around the bend before he had time to get clear. After the call, I sat in the cabin for a long time listening to the rain. Around 2:10 a.m., I saw him again, standing in the same place, waving. But this time, something felt different. He wasn't waving toward the tracks. He was waving toward the cabin, toward me, slowly, urgently, back and forth. back and forth. I stood up from the desk and stepped outside. "Hey!" The man stopped waving. Then he pointed down the track behind me. I turned. A passenger train was approaching the curve faster than usual. Its headlights were already visible through the rain. Something about the way the rails looked in the light caught my attention. The signal had switched incorrectly, green instead of red. The train shouldn't have been cleared through that section yet. If it continued, it would meet a maintenance vehicle working further up the line. For a moment, I just stood there. Then I ran back inside the cabin and hit the emergency override. The signal dropped to red. A warning tone blasted through the system. Down the track, the passenger train began braking. The screech of steel echoed through the valley. It stopped less than 200 meters from the maintenance vehicle. If it had continued another 30 seconds, there would have been a collision. After everything settled down, I went back outside. The rain had grown heavier. The rails glistened under the signal lights. But the man was gone. I've worked that line for 3 years now. I still sit in that same cabin during the night shift. And every once in a while, when the rain falls just right, I see someone standing down by the tracks. Not waving anymore, just watching the signals, making sure they're right.
Story 6. The Man on the Train. It was raining the night this happened. The kind of quiet rain that falls steadily, tapping against metal roofs and train windows. By the time my shift ended at the airport, it was already early morning, around 4:30. That strange hour when the night hasn't quite ended yet. I usually get a ride home from my boyfriend after work, but that morning he overslept. So instead, I had to take the airport train. Normally, I only ride it for one stop. Most of the people on it are airport workers heading home after night shifts. Pilots, baggage staff, flight attendants. It's usually busy enough that it feels safe. But that morning, my route was longer. I would have to ride 2 stops, then take a bus, and then walk the last stretch home. About 3 kilometers. The rain was already soaking the empty streets outside. When I stepped onto the train, the last carriage was fairly full. I found a seat near the end and put my headphones on, pulling a book from my bag. That's when I noticed him. A young man sitting a few rows away. He looked rough. His long hair was greasy and tangled, his beard thin and uneven. His clothes looked worn and dirty, and even from a distance I could see that his hands were dark with grime. At first, he was trying to talk to 2 flight attendants standing nearby. They didn't seem very interested. Eventually, I stopped paying attention and went back to reading. The train rolled through the darkness outside. Rain streaked across the windows, and the fluorescent lights inside the carriage flickered slightly as the train moved. A few minutes later, we reached the station where I normally get off. The doors opened. Almost everyone stepped out. The flight attendants left. The other airport workers left. The doors closed again, and the train started moving. I looked up from my book. The carriage was empty, except for him and me. At first, that wouldn't have been so bad, but he was staring at me, not just glancing over, staring. His eyes were wide, his mouth slightly open, like he had forgotten how to blink. I looked back down at my book, pretending not to notice, but the feeling of his eyes on me didn't stop. After a few seconds, I heard movement. Footsteps. He had stood up. Slowly, he walked closer. He stopped near my row of seats and just stood there, still staring. I kept my eyes on the page, pretending to read. Then I heard him move again. He walked past me and sat down across the aisle. A few seconds later, he stood up again. This time, he sat down directly behind me. My whole body went tense. I could feel my heartbeat starting to climb. I kept my eyes on the book, not daring to turn around. Then suddenly I felt something warm near my neck. His breath. He was leaning forward, so close I could feel him breathing on my skin. Before I could react, a finger slowly slid along the side of my neck. I froze, completely. For a moment, my brain stopped working. I heard a quiet sound behind me, a strange, whispering hiss. That was when I realized something. If I didn't get away right now, something very bad was about to happen. The train was slowing down. We were approaching the next station. I closed my book slowly and gathered my things into my arms. The doors opened, and the second they did, I jumped up and ran. I rushed out onto the platform and immediately slipped into the next carriage before the doors closed again. My heart was pounding so hard it made my hands shake. I crouched slightly beside the window and looked back through the glass. The man stepped out onto the platform. He looked around, searching. The station was completely empty except for him. For a moment, I thought he might see me, but he didn't. Instead, he kicked the ground in frustration and shouted something angrily to himself. I couldn't hear the words through the glass, but I could read his lips. He was calling me a bitch. The train doors closed again, and the train continued into the rain. By the time we reached the next station, I had already called my boyfriend 15 times. He finally answered, half asleep and confused. He drove to pick me up immediately. I never saw the man again, but for weeks afterward I couldn't stop thinking about that moment on the train. How empty the carriage had been. How close he had been. How easy it would have been for him to hurt me. So a few weeks later I started taking self-defense classes, kickboxing, just in case. Because if that man ever decides to sit behind me again on a quiet train at night, I won't be the one running away next time.
Story 7. The House by the Tracks.
I drive freight trains at night. Most people never see the trains I drive. Freight trains usually move across the country while everyone else is asleep. The job is quiet, sometimes almost peaceful. Just the sound of the engine, the rails beneath the wheels, and the dark forest sliding past the windows. Over the years I've passed through countless places that feel forgotten. Small towns that barely exist anymore. Old factories. Houses standing alone in the woods long after everyone has moved away. But there's one place I used to pass that always stood out. An old railway house deep in the forest. It sits beside the tracks between two remote stations. A small wooden house with faded paint and dark windows. The kind of place that was probably built for railway workers decades ago. It's clearly abandoned. But strangely, it never seems to fall apart. Every time my train passed, the headlights would sweep across the windows for just a few seconds, just long enough to see inside. The rooms always looked empty, until one night, near the end of winter, I was driving south on a routine trip. Nothing unusual about the shift. The forest outside was pitch black, and rain tapped softly against the windshield. As my train approached the house, the headlights lit up the windows, and for a brief second, I saw someone standing inside, just a dark figure in the middle of the room, human-shaped. The train was moving fast, and the house disappeared behind me almost instantly. I told myself it must have been a trick of the light, a shadow, a broken curtain, something like that. Later that night, On the return trip, I watched the house carefully. The room was empty. Over the next few shifts, the same thing happened again. Every time I passed the house heading south, the shadow was there. And every time I passed it heading north, it was gone. I asked some co-workers if they had ever noticed anything strange about that house. No one had. One of them joked that someone had probably placed a mannequin inside. Another said it might just be tree branches casting shadows through the window. Both explanations made sense. But after a while, I started to feel something strange when I passed that place. Almost like, for a few seconds each night, I wasn't completely alone anymore. Then one night in early spring, something else happened. I was listening to a podcast while driving through the forest. Rain was hitting the windshield, and everything outside the cab was completely dark. Just as my train approached the house, my podcast suddenly stopped. At the exact same moment, a loud electronic tone echoed through the cab. It startled me enough that I glanced down at the control panel. Everything looked normal. When I looked back up at the tracks, the house flashed past the window. And just like that, the sound stopped. My podcast resumed like nothing had happened. The timing felt too perfect to be a coincidence. A few hours later, on my return trip, I approached the house again. This time I could see the figure more clearly. It wasn't standing in the middle of the room anymore. It was standing right next to the window, facing the tracks, facing my train. For the first time, I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. Inside the cab, there's a small display that shows system messages and alerts. When I glanced at it that night, I noticed the display had briefly updated. For a moment, it showed something I had never seen before. One word: hello. I stared at the display for several seconds. There was no reason for that word to appear there. No function in the system that would display something like that. Still, the word had been there. And without really thinking about it, I whispered back, hello. After that night, it started happening regularly. Every time I passed the house, the display would briefly show the same message, hello. And every time, quietly in the cab, I answered, hello. Sometimes I could see the shadow in the house. Sometimes I couldn't. But the message always appeared. After a while, I stopped trying to explain it. It almost felt like a strange little ritual. Something that broke the loneliness of those long night drives. Then one night, curiosity got the better of me. As my train approached the house, I spoke out loud. Hello, do you live there? The moment the house passed the window, the display beeped. 2 letters appeared. Yes. The response sent a strange rush through my chest. Excitement, confusion, and somewhere beneath it all, quiet, creeping fear. Still, I kept asking questions over the next few trips. Are you the shadow in the house? Yes. Are you alone? No. Finally, one night, I asked something else. Are you human? For several seconds, nothing appeared. Then suddenly, a violent impact slammed against the windshield. Feathers and dark shapes exploded across the glass. A bird. The train had struck a bird at full speed. It happened sometimes, but the timing felt wrong. Like an answer I wasn't meant to receive. After that, I stopped asking questions. I decided it would be smarter to ignore the whole thing. But I still had one more trip along that route that night. When I approached the house again, I deliberately looked away from it. I didn't want to see the shadow. But just before the train passed the house, I glanced toward the tracks. The shadow was outside now. standing beside the rails. Next to it, a deer was wandering slowly near the track. Both shapes were facing my train. Before I even understood what was happening, the deer stepped onto the rails. The impact was immediate. A heavy thud echoed beneath the locomotive. I hit the emergency brake and called it in over the radio. Freight trains take a long time to stop. When the train finally came to rest, the forest around me was completely silent. The house was far behind me now, hidden somewhere in the darkness. The dispatcher asked what I had hit. I told them it was probably a deer. But when they asked if I was certain, I hesitated, because for a moment I had seen something else standing there too. Something tall. Something watching. After the call ended, the cab fell silent again. Then the display beeped. I looked down slowly. 2 words appeared. Come out. The message blinked again and again, but I didn't move. I just sat there with my eyes closed until help finally arrived. They found the deer. Nothing else. No footprints. No other signs of anything near the tracks. After that incident, I asked to never drive that route again. The company didn't question it. Drivers sometimes request different routes after accidents. Now I drive other lines. Different forests. Different nights. But sometimes, when the train cuts through the darkness and the headlights sweep across empty houses in the woods, I can't help wondering if the shadow is still there, standing in that quiet railway house, waiting for the next train, waiting to say hello.
Story 8. Trauma Room 2. There is a lot to say about hospitals, if you are the kind of person who believes in the supernatural, and perhaps for good reason, because hospitals are places where souls seem to move in and out at a remarkable pace. People are born, people die, sometimes slowly and painfully, sometimes suddenly and without warning. Some people step into death for a brief moment, only to be pulled back into life again. Taken together, I believe all of this creates something like a vortex, a chaotic tangle of doors opening and closing between worlds. And perhaps that is why hospitals so often become the setting for strange events. For most of my professional life, I have worked as a nurse at several hospitals and care facilities. When I was young and newly graduated, my first job was on an orthopedic ward at a mid-sized hospital. There was one room there that staff tried to avoid placing patients in whenever possible. We would rather declare the entire ward full than admit someone to that room. The unfortunate patients who did end up spending a night there often reported the same things. The television would suddenly turn on in the middle of the night at full volume. The window would swing open wide, even though it required a key to unlock it. Many described a strong sense of unease, the feeling that someone in the room was staring at them. Even if those things sound like little more than circumstantial details, I can promise you that simply stepping into that room was enough to make even the bravest person uncomfortable. More than once, even when the room was empty, someone from the staff had to go in just to turn off the television and lock the window again. Further down the corridor, there was a shared room with 5 beds for male patients. Strange things happened there much less often. But one evening that began like any other quickly turned restless. Again and again, the men pressed the call button and asked us to make the girl leave. They described a small girl, maybe 5 years old, walking around the room and sitting at the foot of their beds. The entire evening was chaotic until things eventually settled down again. Later that night, an older colleague quietly told me that many years ago, the floor below that ward had once been a pediatric unit. Not long after that, I transferred to the ear, nose and throat department. There weren't any stories there like the ones on orthopedics. Still, There was something unsettling about the far end of the corridor, the only corridor the ward had. At the end of it, there was an elevator, mostly used for transporting supplies. Sometimes, to help the nursing assistants, I would take the elevator down to the underground tunnels with the food carts that had to be returned to the kitchen after lunch or dinner. Inside the elevator, there was a mirror. Instinctively, people avoided looking at it while riding down. Everyone seemed to do whatever they could not to glance at the mirror, and no one could really explain why. We all just felt the same strange, unexplainable discomfort. It wasn't until several months later that I learned the elevator also went straight down to the pathology department. When the doors opened on that floor, you stepped out directly opposite the cold storage room where the deceased were kept. I am quite sure that explained the unease we all felt at the end of that corridor, and especially in that elevator.
These days I work in the emergency department at one of the larger hospitals in the region, where I have been for about 10 years. During that time I worked both in the old emergency ward and in the new building that replaced it a couple of years ago. In the old ER, we experienced the more classic kinds of hauntings. Doors would open and close on their own. One evening, several of us were standing together looking down one of the corridors when the doors to each patient room slowly slid open in perfect unison, as if on cue. The ceiling lights were motion activated and would sometimes switch on even though no one was nearby. We witnessed that more than once while watching the surveillance cameras that showed the corridors outside the emergency entrance. Sometimes we even saw shadowy figures moving through those empty hallways. There was also a room that staff jokingly used to test new employees. It was a storage room that we would show them, then casually ask what they thought of it. I have never met anyone who didn't feel an overwhelming sense of anxiety in that room. During my first 2 months on the job, I dreaded going in there and couldn't understand why it terrified me so much. One evening, someone finally told me the reason. The storage room had once been the room where we placed the deceased, so that their families could say goodbye in private before the bodies were taken to the morgue. Today, we work in a completely new section of the hospital, built on land where no hospital building had stood before. In theory, there shouldn't be any history there to explain strange events. But not long after the new emergency department opened, things began happening in one of the trauma rooms. We have 2 identical trauma bays, specially equipped to handle severe injuries such as gunshot wounds or major traffic accidents. The rooms are arranged exactly the same, and patients are distributed evenly between them. For some reason, though, something seems to have attached itself to Trauma Room 2, T2. Every room has a checklist that staff must go through each day to make sure all equipment is present and functioning properly. Sometimes a couple of us do the checklists together. It goes faster that way, and it gives us a chance to step away for a few minutes and talk. But when the department is busy, often only one person has time to do it. That means standing alone in the trauma room. And whenever you stand alone in T2, you clearly hear the door at the end of the corridor open, followed by footsteps approaching. Yet, every time you look out into the hallway, there is no one there, and the door is closed. There is also a storage closet in the room with a frosted glass door and a motion sensor in the ceiling. One night, when I was doing the checklist alone, I saw the ceiling light inside the closet suddenly switch on through the frosted glass. The door slowly opened all the way and then closed again. A second later, I felt something I can only describe as the strongest sensation I have ever experienced. The overwhelming feeling that someone was standing just inches in front of me, screaming at the top of their lungs. But I neither saw nor heard anything. Another thing happened once that still makes me question my own memory. It sounds like a cliché horror story, but I swear it happened. Each trauma room has a digital control panel that manages temperature, humidity, and ventilation. Part of the checklist is starting a self-test on the panel. When the test begins, and ends about a minute later, the panel plays a cheerful little melody, something that sounds like it came from an old video game from the 1990s. One night,
Again, when I was alone in the room, I started the self-test and heard the normal, cheerful melody play. But immediately afterward, the same melody repeated from somewhere else in the room. Only it sounded wrong, as if someone were trying to imitate the tune on a badly tuned piano using the lowest and darkest notes possible. The sound made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I have never experienced it again, and I have never heard anyone else describe the same thing. There is also nothing in that room that could possibly produce those kinds of tones. I know many of my colleagues consider T2 the most uncomfortable room in the entire department, and several refuse to do the checklist there alone. But I haven't heard anyone else say they have experienced actual events inside it. Maybe I'm simply more sensitive than others, or maybe it was just coincidence. I don't know. But I do know this. If you want the best chance of experiencing something supernatural in that hospital, spend some time alone in Trauma Room 2.
Story 9. My grandmother's photograph. I've kept a diary for as long as I can remember. What I'm about to describe is based on an entry I wrote the night it happened. That's one of the reasons I still believe it wasn't something my mind invented afterward. At the time, I was living in another city, but had come home for Christmas to stay with my parents in my childhood apartment. The apartment is fairly large, with several rooms and a small loft level. During my childhood, I had slept in almost every room at some point, but that Christmas, my bed was up on the loft. I've always had trouble sleeping. I wake up easily and often during the night. Because of that, I've spent years lying awake in the dark, listening to the sounds of the apartment, the hum of the refrigerator, pipes in the walls, the elevator in the building, or my parents snoring from their bedroom. After so many sleepless nights growing up there, I had learned exactly what every normal sound in that apartment was supposed to be. That will matter later. During that Christmas, all of us siblings had come home again. Everyone else slept in different rooms on the lower floor, while I slept upstairs on the loft. The head of my bed was right beside the staircase. The only thing separating the loft from the floor below was a wooden railing. Otherwise, it was completely open. There's one more detail that's important to the story. Around that time, my grandmother, who was well into her 90s, had started talking to photographs. They had become her company when she felt lonely. She spoke to them as if they were real people. She knew it might seem strange, but it comforted her. One photograph in particular mattered to her, an old black and white portrait of my late grandfather. At some point, she had taken a black marker and drawn all over the picture. Almost the entire photo was covered in dark ink, except for two large eyes and a long, narrow red mouth. Within the dark ink, you could still make out the shape of a suit. The first time I saw what she had done to that photo, it genuinely scared me. The image was deeply unsettling. When we asked her why she had done it, she refused to explain. I asked who she had drawn, but she became uncomfortable and wouldn't answer. That was unusual, because my grandmother was normally very open about everything. Even stranger, she carried that altered photograph with her almost everywhere. Then came the night. It was sometime in December, around 3:30 in the morning. I was asleep on the loft when suddenly I heard a voice say, "There's someone here. You can't see it, but it can see you." I jolted upright in bed and realized I was drenched in sweat. Instantly, I was completely awake, and every part of my body felt the same thing. I was not alone. Something dark, darker and more solid than the darkness around it, stood a few feet away at the foot of my bed. I don't know if it lasted a second or several minutes. I was frozen with fear. Suddenly, I thought of my grandmother's photograph. The distorted face, the suit, the eyes and that long, red mouth flashed into my mind. A fear unlike anything I had ever felt spread through me. I didn't dare move. I barely dared breathe. Everything seemed to stand still. Finally, I managed to reach for the lamp beside my bed and switch it on. The light hurt my eyes.
but when I looked toward the place where the figure had stood, the room was empty. I wiped the cold sweat from my face and then noticed something on my arm. 3 thin red marks. At first I thought it might be blood, that maybe I had scratched myself in my sleep. I tried rubbing them away, but they wouldn't disappear. Looking closer, they looked like fingers. 3 long, narrow finger marks. I tried placing my own fingers over them, but they didn't match. The marks were too thin and positioned at an odd angle. It didn't look like something I could have done to myself. Then I heard movement downstairs. I froze and listened carefully. I could hear my younger brother coughing in his room. My parents were snoring. Everyone seemed to be asleep. But something was moving in the kitchen. It sounded like footsteps, yet not quite. There was movement across the floor, but without the familiar sound of bare feet touching it. The steps moved quickly and restlessly, as if whoever was walking didn't know where they were going. I lay completely still, trying to think of a logical explanation. Then the sounds suddenly stopped. After a while, I decided I had to go downstairs and check. I wouldn't be able to sleep otherwise. I got out of bed and turned on the light above the staircase. Walking down felt uncomfortable, like the darkness behind me might reach out between the steps and grab my legs. I didn't turn on the lights in the hallway because I didn't want to wake anyone. Instead, I went straight into the kitchen and turned on the small light above the stove. No one was there. I checked the living room. Empty. I listened outside each bedroom door. Everyone was asleep. Strangely, the fear I had felt upstairs was now completely gone. I turned off the lights and walked calmly back up the stairs. Back in bed, I considered waking my sister to tell her what had happened, but she had to get up early, and I let her sleep. Instead, I lay there with the blanket pulled halfway over my head and the lamp still on, trying not to fall asleep again. My thoughts kept returning to my grandmother's altered photograph. Could that strange figure somehow be connected to what had just happened? I didn't know. Years have passed since that night. My parents still live in the same apartment, and whenever I return for Christmas, I sleep in the same place, on the loft above the stairs. The photograph my grandmother carried with her no longer exists. Eventually, she became frightened of it herself, and we had to throw it away. But every December, when I lie awake in that same bed, trying to fall asleep, the memory of that night comes back to me. Story 10. Something was off in our house growing up. What I'm about to describe isn't particularly terrifying or original for people who are used to reading creepypastas. I deliberately chose to write a genuine account of a few strange things that happened in the suburbs. With very little effort, I could have exaggerated and embellished most of it, but at the cost of honesty. So, instead of trying to compete with the more dramatic stories out there, this is simply a piece of ordinary suburban life. In the mid-1990s, when I was in high school and my younger sister was still in elementary school, we lived with our parents in a townhouse neighborhood on the edge of the city. Recently, we found some old Hi-8 home videos in a plastic bag that had been sitting in storage for years. Watching them pulled us back into that era. Old TV shows, furniture with strange geometric patterns in pink and green, and hairstyles so retro they'll probably become fashionable again someday. A lot of memories came back while watching those tapes. What surprised me the most was how much of childhood you manage to forget, and how quickly it fades away. It was mostly pleasant to revisit that time, but alongside those memories were a handful of strange events that had been woven into everyday life back then. Those memories had also faded, but now they began creeping back. For the most part, life was completely ordinary. Our parents worked full-time. We went to school, hung out with friends, and spent time outside.
We had an old grey car that already felt outdated at the time, with a broken fuel gauge that forced us to track the mileage carefully. Skateboarding was popular. Friday nights meant game shows on TV. For a long time we still used a VHS player where every movie had to be rewound after watching it, something kids today would probably find impossible to imagine. At one point, I even stole a cigarette from my father just to try one of life's forbidden things, though I never became a smoker. The townhouse itself was probably built sometime in the late 1980s. It was a typical design, 2 floors and an attic, a small patio in the back, neighbors on both sides in the same row of houses. In the middle of the neighborhood, there was a playground surrounded by more townhouses. There were seasonal celebrations, occasional disputes between neighbors, and a soccer field behind the houses next to a patch of woods where you might occasionally spot wildlife wandering through. Life had its ups and downs like anyone else's, but overall it was ordinary. No one in our family was religious or particularly superstitious, but we never mocked strange stories either. If we read something about UFOs or ghosts in a magazine or saw it in a movie, we found it interesting in a curious way. It was entertaining because it was probably fiction. Maybe that curiosity made what we experienced later feel more real, as if that open-minded attitude had made us more sensitive to things we couldn't explain, even as we tried to rationalize them as coincidences or misunderstandings. Eventually, whenever we ran out of logical explanations, our conversations would end in the same quiet phrase, "I don't know." Then we would drop the subject.
It's hard to say when it started, or in what order things happened, but the clearest thing we all remember was the scraping sound coming from the attic. To get up there, you had to open a ceiling hatch that folded down with a pull-down ladder. The attic belonged entirely to our home, unlike some townhouse rows where the attic spaces connect across multiple units. It was just a normal attic. Suitcases, boxes of old books and clothes, winter equipment stored away. You only went up there occasionally to retrieve something. I remember it being fairly small and not particularly creepy. There were small openings that let in daylight, so it never felt dark or frightening. But the sound. It came in short bursts, maybe 2 or 3 seconds long. It sounded exactly like someone slowly pushing a wooden chair back and forth across the wooden floorboards above us. Again and again. Several times a day, sometimes at night. It didn't happen constantly. Some days it was quiet, but it returned often enough to be noticeable. Whenever we went up to check, there was nothing there, and while we were standing in the attic, the sound would stop completely. But as soon as we came back down, sometimes it would start again. Our parents didn't really know what to say when we asked about it. Reading about supernatural things in magazines is one thing. Experiencing something unexplained in your own bedroom is different. My father became briefly fascinated by it and suggested that maybe one of our neighbors was vacuuming upstairs and the sound carried through the walls. But we quickly ruled that out when we compared it to the sound of our own vacuum cleaner upstairs. It sounded completely different. The scraping sound felt deliberate. Still, we rarely talked about it. Whenever the sound stopped for a while, we simply forgot about it again. I don't even remember whether we ever asked our neighbors about it. What would we have said? Eventually, the noise became the unspoken elephant in the room, something strange that existed quietly in the background of daily life. And every time we discussed it, we ruled out every explanation we could think of. Rats, birds on the roof, ventilation, wind, neighbors, anything. At times, it even felt ridiculous. Ghosts in our attic. Really? It wasn't some centuries-old mansion with a mysterious past. It was just a suburban townhouse. So we joked about it. Maybe that was simply how we coped. Once, a bird somehow flew down our chimney and ended up inside the metal lining. From the living room, we could hear it desperately scrambling and beating its wings until it eventually found the open fireplace and escaped. The dull banging and scratching from its claws and beak sounded nothing like the scraping we heard from the attic. But the incident left behind a strange sense of unease. If the attic noise had been the only thing, we probably would have ignored it entirely.
But other things happened. I used to take the bus to school every morning. Back then, some buses still had a cord you had to pull to signal the driver instead of a stop button. The 90s really were a different time. I listened to a lot of rock music back then, and at one point I had a cheap band flag hanging on the wall above my bed, attached with thumbtacks. Several times a week when I came home from school, one of the top corners had slipped loose. The thumbtack was still in the wall. There was simply no way the thin fabric could have slipped off the pin by itself, not even from a draft. At first I assumed someone in the family was messing with me, but that kind of joke wasn't really our style. After a while it became unsettling simply because it kept happening. I would come home, take off my jacket, walk upstairs, and slowly look toward the far end of my room. Had the corner slipped down again? Often it had. Eventually, I think I just took the flag down.
Another time I got up in the middle of the night to go to the bathroom. My sister later insisted the object involved was a necklace I sometimes wore, but I'm fairly sure it was actually a pair of underwear, since I slept without much on back then. When I returned to bed, the object was suddenly lying on my pillow, or under it, depending on whose memory you believe. I distinctly remember that it had not been there when I got up, but I was half asleep and ignored it. Looking back now, it feels unreal. I even remember my first thought at the time: had I offended a ghost by sleeping naked? Another incident might have had a simple explanation. One evening, while lying in bed, I felt something tug at my blanket. Maybe the blanket had slipped over the edge of the bed and caught on something when I moved my legs. Or maybe it was something else. By that point, it was hard not to think about the other times objects had seemed to move. Still, if there really had been some presence in the house, its behavior made no sense. It wasn't like the dramatic poltergeist stories you hear about. But I wasn't the only one affected. One evening, my sister had been home alone. When I arrived, I found her sitting in front of the TV with the volume turned all the way up, crying so hard her mascara had run down her face. She told me the door to the downstairs bathroom, right beside the hallway where I was standing, had opened by itself several times. She was completely terrified. I had never seen her like that before, and it definitely wasn't an act. Even if the house had been perfectly tilted and the hinges perfectly balanced, that door couldn't have behaved the way she described. Another time, she said she suddenly felt freezing cold in her room and sensed someone there. She even claimed she saw the blue liquid in the room thermometer drop slightly. I had trouble believing such a perfectly cinematic ghost moment, but the bathroom door incident lingered in the back of my mind. Who was I to dismiss my frightened little sister? These events never repeated in exactly the same way, and every time I convinced myself there must be a normal explanation, something else would happen that sent a cold shiver down my spine. After school, I would return home again to that strange feeling. Life went on. Everyday routines diluted the events, and somehow they became part of normal life. Sometimes I wonder whether other families experience things like that. Do they handle it differently? Eventually, we all moved out, and by the mid-2000s, the townhouse was completely empty of our family. I have no idea whether the people living there now have experienced anything similar. But sometimes I'm tempted to go back, knock on the door, and ask a few strange questions.